Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Literacy Podcast. Melissa and Lori love literacy. Melissa, I can't wait for today's conversation, especially because we're crossing some oceans to talk to our guest today.
Our first international podcast.
Yes, it's very exciting. So we are talking today to James Murphy, who edited the researchED Guide to Literacy, an evidence-informed guide for teachers. And Melissa, I know we read this guide and found such value in it. And when we talked to James, it was just, in our pre-call, it was just so exciting to hear his thoughts. So I can't wait for this conversation.
I learned a lot. And you know that one of the things that bothers both of us is when people just like slap on this is research-based, or this is science of reading aligned, and it's not really. And so I'm really, I was excited to read the book for that reason, to see like, what does it really mean to be evidence-informed, and what actually is and what isn't. So it's exciting to have this conversation today.
So James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
We are excited to have you, and we're thrilled that you took some time, and we know you're really busy and you're an esteemed author, so thank you. Would you share a little bit about yourself and just frame who you are for our listeners?
Sure. Well, a little bit of personal background. The accent is from New Zealand. My parents are both Irish. I was born in Wales. I grew up in New Zealand, having travelled there via Australia. And I've been back teaching in the UK about 15 years now. I guess I had been teaching for some time, and about 7 years into my teaching realised that there were some things I didn't know. Like, for example, how come the students I taught paragraphs to last year not only can't remember how to do it, but swear it never happened at all?
Right.
And why is it that we teach things and we don't remember them? And of course, one of the things that made me realize when that happened was all these years I've been thinking, what did their last teacher teach them?
Right.
And their last teacher taught them exactly what they were supposed to, but they hadn't remembered. So that put me on a path which eventually led to me doing a master's in education and a postgraduate diploma in special education. And that really has changed my whole professional direction in terms of trying to get the message to colleagues that there are ways of teaching those students who have traditionally been failed or rejected by the education system.
And thank you we can't wait to hear all of what you have to say, but first and foremost, thank you for framing where your accent is from, because it's beautiful. I just want to listen to you talk all day.
Well, there aren't that many people who would say that. Sure.
Melissa and I are too. We could just listen all day long and talk literacy with you all day long.
Yeah, there's lots to talk about, isn't there? That's and I think that literacy is so often regarded as some kind of poor relation in education, as if it's what the leftover teachers who aren't good enough to teach the other kids are meant to do. Whereas, in fact, one of our many mantras is the most serious learning difficulties require the highest level of teaching skills. And so if you want to be good at teaching children to read, and if you want to be good at teaching children to write and to spell, there is a lot to learn. The ones who learn it kind of almost effortlessly and by themselves are the ones who should get the credit. When we have those children in our class, there's very little credit that we can take as teachers. The test for us as a teacher is what happens when we run into a student with problems.
Yeah.
So would you like to talk about this researchED guide that we published.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm wondering.
I want to jump into that.
And I'm wondering how it came to be. Like, how did this become a thing? How did it become your thing?
researchED wanted to put out a number of guides. Having had conferences over a number of years, it was clear that there's strong scientific consensus around some issues. And the aim was to create some short, effectively research digests for teachers that they can dive into and get the key points out of the research with practical application to how they teach. In the case of the literacy guide, we deliberately pitched it slightly ahead of the beginner. It's meant to be slightly meaty, demanding. It's basically post-grad stuff. We're assuming that our teachers are educated. We're assuming that they want to know and that they're prepared to do some hard work. It's not for people who want a 5-minute lesson plan or, a few bullet points or posters on the wall. This is for people who really want to reflect on their practice.
Yeah, but I would say, at least my experience reading it is, I agree, it's totally meaty, but it's also short enough that it doesn't feel overwhelming, right? Like that, I feel like I could read one of the chapters in, I don't know, a half hour. I want to reread it again, but it wasn't so meaty that it turned me off, and I just said, I don't have time for that.
Yeah, exactly. And so one way that this book can be used is by schools in their professional development programs. Teachers can go away and read a chapter in half an hour or so, then come back together and discuss and reflect on how they might act on that to adjust or test their practice in some areas. So, but exactly that, teachers are busy people. They're often tired people. At the end of the day, they often fall asleep in front of the TV. So it's,
I've been there.
So we don't want to give them a big weighty book. It's great if they want a summer read, on the beach or whatever. But I think for actual practical reference during the teaching year, you want short, meaty chunks that people can read and digest.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I found it so interesting because there were lots of research pieces cited that I had not encountered before. So I felt excited about learning new research points that were cited in the guide. And there are so many references in each chapter. Like I'm just looking, for example, at chapter 1, there's like 33 citations. So that's a huge benefit to the reader, to us, to be learning lots of different elements of research as we're reading. That, chapter 1 is I'm looking at how many pages. It's not a whole lot of 10 pages, and there's 33 references, so maybe 12 pages. That's meaty. And but it was so interesting that it didn't feel heavy to read. So I just want to put that out there.
Yes. And in fact, in chapter 2, Kerry Hempinstall's chapter on myths and misconceptions around literacy teaching. Kerry's reference list, I think, goes from page 36 to 47. It's massive. And one of the reasons I wanted him in there, actually, is because his reference lists are gold. And you can... Yeah. He publishes blogs on the website of the National Institute for Direct Instruction, NIFTY. And his blogs are also full of research references. He's an absolute encyclopedia. So having Kerry in there is a huge advantage for any teacher who's serious about digging into this stuff.
Yeah, and that one in particular is really intriguing. So for those listening, we'll post a link to, if you'd like to purchase the researchED guide to literacy, we'll post a link so that you can do that. But chapter 2 is the one that James is talking about now, and it's titled Myths and Evidence. And you're right, there are, I checked, there's a ton of, I figured you knew, there's like 143 citations on that one. Yep. But it's really interesting because it incorporates the the music training and how that helps with, it's so varied in the evidence that it's citing. It's not just just like cognitive processes.
Yes, and I think the great thing about Kerry is he's quite objective. He doesn't go around just trashing stuff and saying, oh, that's rubbish and don't do that. What he says is there is no evidence in the peer-reviewed literature for this yet, so teachers should be wary about investing time and students' energy in this. However, consider this. Actually, there's not much evidence for that either. And most of that chapter is about things that have been tried but don't have much evidence. And one of the reasons for that is we really want teachers to be good at evaluating the evidence for what they're being told is a great idea, as opposed to just being, having to respond to authority figures and just do what they're told.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, because I feel like anything that's out there, right? Things we're told as teachers or products, they often they come with those stickers that are like, there's evidence for this.
Science of reading aligned.
And sometimes it is just like a study or, it's just, I'm wondering how do you all, figure out how do you evaluate what is actual evidence informed versus sometimes what we see, which is just like I don't know, maybe one study or something. Like how do we help teachers know the difference between those?
Sure. I think that as kind of the first thing is the contributors to this book are all people with academic and practical experience, and they have all actually looked at the consensus of scientific evidence. And the first thing is, where is there a convergence of scientific evidence? The second point to that is then, well, what do you mean by scientific evidence?
Yeah.
And we would say we're primarily interested in peer-reviewed studies, published journals. That's the kind of the convention for establishing scientific consensus. The third aspect of that is that one study, as you say, is not enough. We need to see replications or confirmations of that over time. That takes time and it takes money. So some of those are slow to emerge. But there are a number of things around reading in particular, which is clearly the most researched topic in educational research, that have drawn together a very strong consensus. And in the chapter by the Weldalls and Buckingham on moving towards a label-free approach to resolving reading difficulties, they talk about that scientific evidence and the fact that we don't need separate classifications of poor readers and dyslexics and so on. We just need to know how to teach children with reading difficulties.
Yeah.
I think that a key point is that things are often truthy. They sound like they should work. Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, it's not my original idea. It's a phrase been around for a while, but they sound like they should be true. The VAK learning styles, for instance, seems like it should work. And indeed, some of the physical exercise programs, when you listen to people's explanations, sound like they should work. But when you actually look at the research, one of the guiding things that has come out is you tend to get what you teach. If you get someone to do a lot of music practice, they'll tend to be much better at music. But there's no particular reason why we would expect that to transfer to their reading. Teaching children to play chess better tends to create better chess masters, but it doesn't actually make them better at reading. And getting students to improve their visual memory, for instance, you will get students perhaps with better visual memory, but that again does not change or improve their reading.
Yeah. I think that's yes, we need to help. I think one of the, Melissa and I have a lot of conversations and we are in those, Facebook science of reading groups and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I just feel so compelled to sometimes comment and be like when people ask questions, because people are posting things they're going to Facebook to find knowledge about the science of reading. They're going to, places where they're relying on other educators. And what I find interesting about that is that, all of us educators don't necessarily have the same knowledge base in the science of reading, and we don't have the accurate knowledge base, right? So some do, some don't. And some are just like dangling in this in-between area. And so I'm just like, I would just love to know, like, you know, how can we learn what is research-based from this guide? Like, how can this guide help us understand what's evidence-based, what's research-based? I honestly think the first couple chapters are just awesome. And the one that you just mentioned, a non-categorical approach to teaching low progress readers in the primary school.
Yep.
It's so, I feel like I need to interpret that for the United States. And but I mean, same concept, right? Like we need to rejig the title to apply. But if we have that approach that it's not categorizing kids, it's categorizing struggles and then approaching the struggles versus categorizing the student.
Exactly right.
I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on that, because I think this guide is immensely helpful. I can't wait to give it another read. Like, take two and learn more.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a short answer and then a slightly more circuitous answer. The short answer is that I think if you want to get to grips with education research, the researchED guides are quite helpful, and I can say that confidently, on the basis that I'm not receiving any royalties for saying that. But
neither are we. Yay!
Yeah. So the other thing I would say, though, is that the chapters here, if you look at the way that the writers, particularly in those first two chapters, go about kind of saying this is valid and this isn't and why, and you'll see the way that they look at the studies and the number of studies that have been done and what are the clearly appointed or agreed strategies or approaches from the wider scientific community. There's a wonderful paper actually that I would really recommend people think about by Keith Stanovich and Paula Stanovich. Do you know Keith Stanovich? He's a really He's a really well-known reading researcher based at Toronto University, and he became prominent in the 80s when his research discovered, against his expectations, that good readers don't rely on context; they're actually decoding the words, and it's the poor readers who are relying on context. And it had been until then, there had been a strong consensus in the other direction. And that was when, if you like, the reading wars began in earnest. Because some people were quite unhappy with Keith. And he's done a wonderful paper called Using Science and Reason in Education. I think that's the name of it. And in it, they point out exactly this question of how teachers can get to grips with what's got a research base and what doesn't, what should we spend our time on and what shouldn't we, and what do you do when there isn't a lot of peer-reviewed research, but the approach looks promising. And he talks about the fact that, you know, as a teacher, you're actually free to apply reason as well, but here are some guidelines. When I say he, I mean they. So I'd really recommend Stanovich. I think that's 2003, Stanovich K and Stanovich P. That's a really good starting place for getting to grips with research and practice. On the wider issue, what I would say is that education has had two main streams. One stream has been focused on what you might call the sociology of education. It has seen it as a social interaction and often as a political transaction. And there is much truth in that. It is a social interaction. It does have political implications, and some of those are quite significant. But that area has been so beset by polemic that it's become almost evidence-free at its extremes, and it's about who agrees with my ideology. And then at the other end, you've got a stream that is mostly focused on psychology and how people learn stuff. It's a much smaller quadrant of the sector, and at its extreme, that can become abstract in the sense of a bit ivory tower about things that might work and might not, and focused on things like statistical significance, which has very little bearing. And then you see studies, for example, that suggest that an effect size of 0.24 for a reading intervention is fine, even though what that translates to is about 3 months additional progress for a child who may be 4 or 5 years behind. And the child can't even see the progress that they've made. So that kind of dabbling with academic statistical significance has been, in my view, very harmful to education. It discredits research, and it means that we're not focusing on what will actually make a difference for children. So we've got both those problems, or both those extremes to contend with, and then you've got people in the middle who kind of shrug and go, gee, I don't know, I'll just close the door to my classroom and do my best.
Yeah. Can
Probably
you contextualize? Yeah. I'm wondering if you can contextualize where balanced literacy fits on that continuum, and where science of reading fits on that continuum, just to stamp that for our listeners.
Sure. So the work that's going on at the moment, the last couple of years, a lot of it's become sort of pulled under this banner of the science of reading. And you can tell that's having an effect, because now there are people writing blog posts and articles saying there's no such thing as the science of reading and we can't know anything about reading. It's like, sorry, you're 50 years too late. We do know quite a lot about reading. So the science of reading stuff is around that psychology end of the education spectrum, but it's very much focusing now on implementation. If this is the case, then how do I teach that to a student? Yeah. Or if this is the problem they have, how can I resolve that? And the science of reading stuff is fantastic, because it's now at a point of development where it's offering practical solutions and implementation steps for teachers. And many of those simply require a small tweak in the way that we provide explanations or present information, or what we choose to focus the time on. It doesn't require any extra time or money. Balanced literacy is an interesting point, because we didn't hear too much about balanced literacy. We used to hear a lot about whole language. Then when the evidence was pretty clear that phonics is what students need to ensure that they move out of that emergent reader phase, people who had been advocating whole language said, well, of course, we've never been against phonics. What we are talking about here is just that there's no best way overall. And what we need to do is just combine things for whatever's right for that child. And as teachers, we know best. To which my answer is, unless we're highly skilled, we don't know best. Why would we? And in fact, the problem with it is that it gives the teacher a great deal of fluidity. Without some really clear accountability on student progress in reading, balanced literacy can just become a narrative that we use to justify the status quo of 20% of students going through primary and then secondary school unable to read successfully. It doesn't mean that we can't do other things. Of course we do. We build on initial phonics with a wide and rich experience of literature and storytelling. We expose them to a range of different types of texts and all of that. We want them to develop comprehension skills. The problem is, if your balanced literacy version includes strategies like what word would make sense in that sentence, what word would make sense based on the first letter, look at the picture and think about what might be going on. Those strategies aren't just not helpful to the student, they actively undermine any phonics training that they've had and make it more difficult and more confusing for the child to make progress.
I was just thinking, Lori, of the teacher that we just talked to, who said that, she had probably about the similar to what you said, James, like 20% of her students who at the end of kindergarten went to first grade not reading on the level they should be, but she didn't really know why. And now that she's learning the science of reading, what she said was like, now I know why. I can figure out this is what they're missing and help them versus I don't really know. I tried.
But I think what's paramount to mention there, Melissa, is that now that she knows and she implemented the science of reading, like research. She's teaching them how to understand the phonemic awareness, the phonics. She's using a systematic approach.
Yep.
100% of them, 100% of her students met the assessment benchmark.
Yep.
So, and that's not even, she just started learning about it in, I'd say December. She said December, right?
Yep.
So that's like 6 months ago.
Yep.
It's not even a lifetime. Like, I think that's what's important to know. And I want to draw it back to, James, what you just said, to really the first chapter of the book, the guide, is about foundational skills. Mm-hmm. And that, I think it's really, I assume that's there intentionally in the very beginning, that first chapter, to share about foundational skills. And then the book kind of progresses from there. So I'm wondering if you can kind of connect what you just shared to the guide and maybe talk through like that first chapter supporting foundational skills research and a little bit. And then maybe we talk again about that second chapter and how to go about questioning those misconceptions, because what you just shared, that like reading is a visual activity, I think is really important to talk a little bit deeper about, because I know that that's a big question that I feel like everyone is asking right now. Like, if we don't do this and I don't have a systematic phonics program, what do I do? It's almost like they're flailing, teachers are flailing in the water versus knowing how to swim, because they know that what they have in materials don't work, but they're not quite sure what does work.
Yeah. And so this, chapter 1 will give teachers a really clear framework for thinking about what is an evidence-based approach. And then the further work, some of the other chapters will build on that. And it is deliberately designed to kind of build up in a sequence from learning to read and then into writing. And we've tended to focus more on the upper levels on that just because of space. But what I would say is, as far as teachers who are setting out, there are some really good training programs around that they can access online, and that will give them the basics. I know the UK one's best, so 2 of them are Sounds Right, so sounds hyphen and then the word right, WRITE, and also Phonics International, and both of those offer an online training program in phonics for parents or teachers. And just having that knowledge base established is immensely helpful. We don't know what we don't know a lot of the time. That's one of our biggest problems. And the one reason for teachers to really engage with research is that it gets us to realize that there are things we may never have thought of, or that concepts and ideas that we had were only superficial, and that actually under examination something else turns out to be quite the case. And reading is particularly deceptive human activity. Our experience of reading as fluent readers is deceptive. The rate at which we are processing language makes us think that we are seeing the words as pictures, and that we have learned them so quickly that we just recognize them. We don't. It's actually where the processing is going so fast, from matching the symbols to words in our spoken language repository, and then matching that with our semantic repository, and then matching that with our perception and working memory of the context, and then that translates back into building on the narrative that we've been acquiring. And all that's happening at lightning speed. So Stanislas Dehaene, the French neuropsychologist, says that fluent readers read at 300 words per minute silently.
Wow.
And what that means is, in 0.2 of a second, you've decoded the word, you've distinguished it from other similar words, you've linked it to meaning, sound, and context and usage, and then you've put that into the meaning of the rest of the sentence and carried on.
Somehow you describing that just made me feel like it's amazing that we learn how to read.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like so much that our brain is doing so quickly.
It's a remarkable testament to what the human brain is capable of, but because it's so ubiquitous, we underrate it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's completely
I mean,
changing.
that's just a huge plug for using, systematic phonics to teach reading, because like you need to wire. That's what I always think about is we're wiring kids' brains. And I know that's not new, but that's the visual that I get in my head. And if we need to wire that so that those systems can interact very, very quickly, like you just described.
Exactly right. So we need to move from the precision teachers, US-based movement started in the 70s. They looked at, from a behavioural perspective, as an applied behaviour analysis, looking at what learning is like at different stages of competence. And they said, the first stage is acquisition, where you're just getting to grips with it. And then the second stage is accuracy, where you can perform it, whatever it is you're learning, accurately but slowly. And then the real bottleneck is building that accurate behaviour to fluency. Mm-hmm. Once you've got to fluency, you have access to generalization. You can use that word or that learning in many different contexts, and you have retention. It's much more likely to remain in long-term memory and be available for recall. Mm-hmm. So getting students not just to accuracy but fluency is the job of the reading teacher, especially in those early years.
Yeah. And in order to do that, you have to know a whole lot. And the research is the key, right?
Yeah. And again, because so much work has been done in the research on reading, actually many of the solutions that we have now are easily applied. For instance, it only takes a few minutes a day of carefully sequenced fluency practice for students to build up very high rates of reading fluency. Mm-hmm. But what the research says is that fluency practice should be short, 1 to 3 minutes. It should be daily, as often as possible during the week. It should be timed so that it's standardized and so that the student has a short target to meet. And it should be carefully sequenced because if you mix up things, then it's really hard to tease which bits of it are giving the student difficulty. So you need them to be able to practice different component skills and then combine those component skills once they've become fluent.
Mm-hmm. I have 2 questions for you, James. Similar topic though. So I've always been in the secondary world, right? So, I've seen this happen where my students are coming in and they're still having some, issues with accuracy or definitely fluency, but we're told to stay, grade level texts, really deep comprehension questions, like, digging in. And that feels like there's a disconnect there at the secondary world of like making sure that they do have those initial skills. But then I also see on the flip side, sometimes I'm in a letters training and I've heard some teachers who have said like, well, why don't we just forget about like reading grade level texts and doing read alouds and all those other things and let's just make sure that they get that accuracy and fluency and like only focus there. And then I'm like, well, that leaves out the whole language comprehension strand of the rope. Yeah. So I'm just wondering what you feel like about the balance of that and how we.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's literally $1 billion question because so much money is spent on ineffective reading intervention or is spent on education that children can't access because their reading skills aren't up there. So resolving that, in my view, is the number one way to make education pay for itself by actually building a better society and a healthier economy. How do we do that? The answer is to think, in my view, from the view of the child's entitlement. What is it that they are meant to be getting? They are meant to be getting an education. Are they getting an education if they can't read? No. If we teach them to read, but they don't know anything else, have they got an education? No. So we have to do both. How do we do both? The answer is really careful assessment and screening. Identify any students with gaps, assess them in enough detail to be able to match the issues they have with an effective short-term intervention, deal with it effectively in that intervention and minimise the time out of the classroom that it requires, and make sure that the classroom offers a challenging, a rich, and really broad education, so that they are, they're equipped for life when they leave school. What bugs me most is that some children are deemed either too stupid or too poor or too dyslexic to warrant a proper education. And the answer is not that the child has a problem. The answer is that the system does not have the expertise resident within it to meet their needs. I mentioned Siegfried Engelmann in our last conversation, and Engelmann is really clear. He says it's not really a case of dyslexia, it's a case of dysteachia. It's because they haven't been taught adequately and rigorously in the early stages that they then continue to have these problems that hamper them throughout their education. It's not necessary, but it does involve teachers kind of humbling ourselves a little bit, admitting we have things to learn, and working out the best way to make this happen in our schools.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the chapter about assessing literacy skills for that reason, because I think when I look at our system, that's one of the things I always bring up is, we have, a 3-time-a-year standard. You get as students, like, are they on grade level, below grade level in reading? But people try and use that to figure out how to help a student, but you really can't, right? You don't know what's going on with a student's reading from that one assessment. So that was a really helpful chapter for me to read.
And also, it depends on the assessment too, right? We have to be critical consumers of the assessment. There's so much that goes, I think your assessment chapter speaks to that, but in the guide, but they're just being a critical consumer of really everything. And I think it's so hard for educators because it just seems like there's so much that they need to know and they're not getting it in their undergrad or in their...
We're having so many people tell them, this is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a group that I would target most strongly for professional development on screening and assessment, it would be school leaders.
I agree.
Undoubtedly, they tend to be the least skilled when it comes to knowing what students need, the least skilled when it comes to knowing how interventions work. They normally avoid special educational needs like the plague. It's seen as a dead end to their career. And as a result, they often lack the knowledge and the skills to effectively implement assessment systems in the school.
And all of this is really exacerbated if there's not a high quality curriculum in place, like a high quality tier 1 curriculum for teachers to use, or high quality structures, right? I think that if you can wrap around a high quality curriculum, then you can provide that short-term intervention in service of the curriculum and in support of, and the assessments then roll into that. Everything can wrap around that. And I feel like that's a huge shift from where we've been before. Curriculum and materials are really at the center, and then everything comes out. Whereas I feel like when I first started teaching, curriculum was at the outside, and in the middle was pedagogy and then standards. And it was just we're flipping the model, but there's such a struggle for understanding.
Yeah. And the curriculum stuff is hard because it's the what of teaching, and it's the sequence of the what. And then we get to now we know what that we're going to teach them in the sequence. How are we going to do that effectively? And that all involves quite a lot of brain power, quite a lot of thinking, but it's well worth it because we all become better teachers as a result. In the process of school improvement, because we often are asked to work with schools who are trying to really build or rebuild or raise standards, we think that there's basically a 3-tier approach, and you can't really get around this sequence. The first is that you have to establish standards of behaviour. Until behaviour is settled in the school and both teachers and senior staff have headspace to think about other things, you focus on getting the behaviour right. Once behaviour is right, you then introduce raising the level of challenge, depth and breadth in the curriculum. And that includes providing more challenging and stimulating texts for children to read. And once you've done that, then it will become apparent who the students are who aren't able to access those texts. In many of the schools that we've worked with, they are turning around from a point where for some years teachers had dumbed down the curriculum and the texts that they were giving students to minimise hassles. And instead what we're saying is no, raise the standard in the curriculum and then we will intervene with the students who aren't able to keep up with that. And that has been borne out time and again, that that way the vast majority of students are straight on and getting more out of their education, and the students who need help can then be addressed in a much calmer and more productive environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that really supports what we talk about all the time on this podcast, is that high quality materials matter, and it matters that students are engaged in rigorous grade level work with teachers who believe that they can do this work.
Yes.
And we're not going to give students who are struggling or who are acting out behaviorally lesser work. We're giving them the work that is grade level, that is appropriate, and then we're going to support them in accessing that work. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Exactly right. So
I was going to ask that, James, because in my experience, I've seen some behavior challenges from students that actually came from the other two things that you mentioned, which was like either they're bored because what they're doing isn't challenging at all, or because they're, they're getting maybe they're struggling with reading. So their way of not having to deal with that is to just do whatever they do behavior wise.
Yep, exactly. And so that's often why, my wife and I have this organisation, Thinking Reading, that's set up to support secondary schools. And we often get the call from schools who say, what we're finding is we've got students who are acting up. And when we look at it, there's a very clear correlation between their behaviour points and their reading age. They've got a high behaviour points and they've got a very low reading age. They clearly can't access what's going on. What do we do for them? And then, as you say, there are other students, if we don't have enough challenge, we will have students who are bored and they either just then get up to mischief, and often very cleverly and without us even noticing, or indeed they'll make life difficult for other students. I remember when I was a head of English in London, the worst behaved boy in the year group, we moved him from the bottom set into the top set, or I think you would call it a track in the States. And his behaviour problems disappeared because the work was harder and nobody was very interested in him making a smart comment. They were all wanting to do the work. And he was clearly very able and needed more stimulation. Instead of going, he's badly behaved, put him in the bottom set, we put him in the top set, Just as
I think that also gets that's a great example. And that also gets back to what you mentioned earlier in how we support intervention, because I think there are two tracks to intervention. And after reading your guide, I believe that I know it's not your guide, but it is your guide, your edited guide. I think that I want to affirm that this is the understanding and the takeaway from the guide as well. And that if you have this tier one, curriculum or experience that is rich with high quality texts and grade level work is what I'm saying, that really the quote interventions that are brief should meet one of the two strands of the rope. So the language acquisition should look like filling in the gaps in foundational skills. And that's very clear. In the tier one, we know that there's going to be fluency, but we also need to address that in the interventions, because we know that that's
Yep.
massively important. But then also, I feel like I struggle a lot in conversations with teachers or with just generally, and I'm just, even friends who are teachers, with like what interventions look like in terms of quote comprehension. And so I think that the chapter that we talked about earlier, the non-categorical approach to teaching low progress readers, that to me is speaking to that approach of like, it's in service of the content that they're learning in their core classes, but we're also trying to support that fluency. So we're not like, it's not easy. It's a lot of stuff put together, but it doesn't look like it does look like students accessing content on topics, but it doesn't look like students doing like passages where they're answering questions to find the main idea, or to do like isolated skill work. And so I feel like it's hard to, it's not an easy, like it speaks to what we've been talking about this whole time. We all need to be so knowledgeable about all of this stuff and be reading the research and really deeply understand it. It's not like well, just throw them in a group and do this and it's fine. And that's the shift that I think your guide is helping to get across, because it was like that, like 20 years ago. It was like, put them in a group, we'll teach them how to find the main idea, and then they can bump right back in and they'll be totally fine. But that's not where we are now. So I'm curious about your take on that, and if my take is accurate.
I think that what we can do in intervention regarding comprehension is necessarily limited, because I was just reading another paper last night actually about the fact that comprehension is so affected by domain knowledge, and domain knowledge is so affected by vocabulary. And so none of these things are independent. The aim is to set up virtuous circles or cycles where we, by addressing children's thinking strategies in the context of knowledge and building their vocabulary so that they can both understand and talk about that knowledge, we're laying foundations. And then the amount that we can do with that is pretty much infinite. The challenge for curriculum designers is to make sure that there is overlap and connection between the different disciplines and knowledge, and within the disciplines and knowledge, there is connection. So having a carefully sequenced science curriculum, for instance, will build from one topic to the other, rather than just move on to the next topic and teach another set of keywords. So you'll continue to review and address some of the keywords. You'll continue to think about how some of the concepts that you learned in the last topic apply to this one. And that kind of curriculum sequence is really important. And it's we've often had, well, not often, sometimes had teachers say, look, you've addressed this child's reading, they're clearly better at reading, but, their comprehension's still not very strong. And it's like, yeah, but how do you expect them in business studies, for example, how can we teach them about that in a reading intervention? You are the business studies teacher, teach them what they need to know, and then once they know that, you will probably find that they can then explain, they can understand, and they can work with it. Intervention is not should not be seen as a bolt-on. It needs to be an integral part of the curriculum, which is brought into play when students have a particular deficit, and that deficit needs to be addressed as quickly and systematically as possible so that they are not losing their curriculum entitlement.
You said what I said so much better. Thank you.
Okay.
I was like, I rattled on. But I agree. And I'm curious, I want to know what you think about, I think in the US, at least, schools are getting lots of funding from COVID and, all this funding that's coming in. I read the 74, and I was reading about how schools are planning to use this, and a lot of schools are planning to use it for reading tutoring, reading intervention. And I just have a bajillion questions for them. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah.
And how are we ensuring that they're wrapping around that content knowledge, that domain knowledge, inclusive of vocabulary? So
there's been a lot of talk here as well. I mean, in the UK, they are spending way less than they are in the States. So let's be clear about that. And there's a fair bit of teacher discontent about that. But I think in short, effective reading intervention is a really good way to use that funding. The question is, what's an effective reading intervention? And what we would say is there a rate of progress of at least 3 months for every month they're in the intervention? In other words, in 4 months in the intervention, they've gained a year in their reading. Now, you can get much more than that. In thinking reading, for example, we regularly see students making 5 years progress in 6 months. So a really systematic reading intervention that is built on really detailed assessment can get really good results. But there are plenty of things out there that don't do that. And I'd argue that they are not a good investment because they actually teach the child they can't do this. Teachers' professional development is really, really important. But again, you can't just assume that the teacher professional development is going to be good teacher professional development. It needs to be systematic, it needs to be research-based, and it needs to engage teachers in professional debate so they're actually thinking and not just doing what they're told. And then, I'm not sure about in the States, but in the UK, we already had really significant inequalities and really significant mental health stresses for some of our young people after years of a program that was dubbed austerity. And disproportionately affected poorer families. Obviously, the pandemic has really exacerbated that, and teachers are very concerned about the mental health of their students and the fact that they are teachers, not mental health workers. And there's a strong consensus here, I think, that investing some of that funding in mental health services in schools would be a very good way of short-circuiting some of the long-term problems that are likely to arise from the pandemic.
It's a really good point that I hadn't thought of.
Yeah. I think you've gotten me to think a whole lot today about the idea of what's truthy and how we can quickly identify what's truthy and what is the truth. And because there's, post-pandemic, all of this, funding is coming in, and the materials now I feel like are being ramped up more than ever. Like that sticker is slapped on, like science of reading aligned, evidence-based. And there, I feel like it's hard to know what's right. Like you said, we don't know what we don't know. And when we're being, and I mean we in the frame of like district leaders, teachers, principals, you have all these materials out and you're thinking, what is the real stuff? Like, let me sift through and find the real stuff that fits. I think the guide would be a phenomenal resource to help, but it is going to be work. Like, I think that's what I want listeners to know is it's not a quick answer. It's not like a question in the Facebook group and you get your answer. And if that is the case, then I think we should question the answer.
Exactly. I think social media has been fantastic for teachers to link to research and to be introduced to research. But if we're just taking our lead from other people's opinions on social media, we're probably in a worse position than when we started. We believe that the answer is to really raise the level of expertise. I'm sure you've heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. That the less we know, the more. Oh, yeah. No, so you have to be careful.
Melissa, have you? Is it just me?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Don't worry.
So, I'm like, Melissa needs to admit whether she knows this or not, because I'm saying I don't.
So Dunning-Kruger effect has been around for a while in psychological circles, and basically it posits that the less people know, about a topic, the more competent they tend to think they are. And the more they know, the less competent they are.
Oh, that's interesting.
They feel. Not because they are less competent, their expertise actually increases, but they are much more aware of what they don't know. And we think that essentially the issue with teaching is this, that teachers need to raise their level of expertise. Teacher training institutions aren't doing that. Governments aren't doing that. We have to do it for ourselves. And that's what the researchED movement is about. And that's why we've done this series of books.
Well, we're excited that you did.
I learned that today.
I know. Thank you.
That's great.
We will put a link to the guide. I'm holding it right now.
You.
Everybody can't see it, but we will put a link to the guide. And also, maybe I'll also link your other book,
that
Thinking
would be great.
Reading. Yeah, because I know we're going to do a part 2 podcast to discuss Thinking Reading, what every secondary teacher needs to know about reading. And that's by James and Diane Murphy. Is that your wife?
Yeah, and Diane's the real expert. So it'd be really good to have her talking about what she knows about how to teach children with reading difficulties, because she's just, she knows it so well, she almost doesn't realize she knows it. And she's been particularly good at that cusp between support and challenge, making the student understand that I believe in you, even though you don't believe in yourself. Let's just follow me and I'll get you over the top. Yeah,
I can't wait for that conversation. That's right in my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Super.
All right, James, to wrap up today, do you have any a piece of advice for our audience that you haven't already shared? You've shared a million things, but one last piece of advice.
One piece of advice: find out about.
It's okay. We always have dogs and children in the background, so no worries. Yeah. You have a ringing phone.
Yeah, it never rings. That our landline only rings at times like this.
It's okay. Cue the advice and the phone rings.
Find out about Siegfried Engelmann, direct instruction, and project follow through.
Got it. I will try to link that too.
Absolutely. Well, it was wonderful to have you today. I learned so much from reading this short guide, but meaty guide. I'm going to keep reading your new book now. And it was just great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you, and look forward to part 2 at some point.
Yes.
Yes, same. Thanks, James.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.